Welcome back to All Things FantomWorks, and today my guest is not only a distinguished author, but my favorite author, and I don't say that lightly. I read a lot, and a lot of authors I find don't write really well, and they certainly don't write about subjects that I love. In this case, I found an author who wrote about something that was incredibly near and dear to my heart, and he wrote about it in such a way that you just can't wait to turn the next page. So today I get to call him Bill, but you're going to know him as Dr. William Forstchen, and he is the best-selling author, the New York Times best-selling author of the 1 Second After trilogy, which folks, soon enough, you will get to do what I just did, which is read the fourth book in the series. So we're going to call it a quadrology, if I'm pronouncing that right. And so with that, good afternoon, Bill.
Good afternoon, and a pleasure being with you today.
Yeah. I've been a car builder for years. I was an American military Spec Ops soldier. I was a pilot. And so, you know, I had this background. For a few years, I taught survival, and I was living kind of a fat, dumb, happy life in Norfolk, Virginia, in the middle of the city. And then this kind of interesting communication came over in early December of 2019, where they were talking about this flu coming out of, circling the world. And it was one of the things that I kept an ear to the ground on. And then in March, when suddenly there was no toilet paper and they were talking about masks and lockdowns, I was at my shop working on a Saturday. I called my wife and I said, get ready, we're going to go look for a farm. And I went home, picked her up, and that afternoon we found a farm on the water, so it's on the Chesapeake Bay.
Wow.
And we bought the farm that afternoon and never looked back. We started moving everything out of the city. And while doing this, I told my wife, because she's an avid reader, and I said, hey, if there's any good books on sort of what we're doing, I would love to read them. And so she's thumbing through and finds 1 Second After. Now, you wrote that, you published it, back in 2009?
2009.
Okay, so I didn't find it. My apologies. I did not find your book until about April of 2020.
So you found it. That's the thing. Yeah.
So I found it. I read it, and Melissa said, that's my wife. She said, "Did you learn anything?" And I said, actually yes. And even though I taught survival and I'm very familiar with what EMP is, and how the Compton scattering sort of works, the gamma rays exciting the electrons. I'm fairly familiar with how it all works. You went through many things in your book that, although I thought of them, it's sort of like just because you think of something, it hasn't quite punched you in the face yet. And Bill, you punched me in the face about 30 times in your first book.
Okay.
And so it was like, okay, so even though I had thought about some of these things, I'm not actively working on them enough. And so I'm fairly convinced most of the characters in the book are in fact inspired by people you know. Would I be correct?
Absolutely, yes. I wrote it about my hometown, Black Mountain, North Carolina.
Okay.
And the college I teach at, Monterey College.
So I'm going to have a confession for you. Although I've now read your entire book series 3 times. And by the way, you are the only trilogy I have ever read 3 times in my life. So I do consider myself a fairly well-read individual, but never have I gone through a trilogy 3 times. So not 9 times for your 3 books total. And of course, thank you. I got your pre-edition of your 4th book.
Good.
Now, are you considering it a quadrology at this point?
When I wrote the first book, 1 Second After, by the time I was done with that, I never wanted to write about it again. That it's the stuff of nightmares. But as said in The Godfather, every time I try to get out, they pull me back in. The publisher made me an offer I couldn't refuse. So it turned into 2 more books, and then finally this last one 5 years after, and I really want to end it there. After that, it just turns into some bizarre story. I'm trying to make a point with my books. I think I've made the point.
Yeah, I think you've made an excellent point. And we won't talk about your newest book since it hasn't been released, other than I'm going to make 2 comments, and it won't be any spoilers at all.
Okay.
Both positive points. So just to finish up the story, after I read your first book, I found out, of course, through my wife that, hey, he's got more. And so we got the rest of the books, and I started going through them. And I became just fascinated with how well you did 2 things. And I also, did you ever read by any chance, and I know they're horrible books, but they're so well written. Did you ever read The Da Vinci Code by any chance?
No, the book that influenced me the most was actually published back in the 50s, and it's called Alas, Babylon, which was about the start of a nuclear war and what would happen across the following year. It's a remarkable classic. That's the one that influenced me. No, I very, very rarely read fiction because I'm too busy doing research.
Of course, yeah, and that makes sense. So I read the Da Vinci Code and a couple of times. I read it twice. And what fascinated me the most about the Da Vinci Code was how well Brown mixed what I would consider, he sort of took a rope that had 3 strands in it. It was sort of, for little boys, it was the codes and cryptexes. For the murder mystery people, it was a murder. And then for the history buffs, it was, and we don't have to get into whether it was valid or not, because I'm convinced most of it was non-valid, but he talked about the lineage of Jesus Christ and the creation of the Knights Templar and you know, the Catholic Church and everything from there. So what I thought he did was he mixed fiction and history in a way that was so spellbinding, it sucked me to the next page. You did the same thing.
Well, thank you.
I'm assuming that, like, so in the first book, and I'll be honest, I cannot remember all the details, and I know you've received a number of accolades from a number of politicians over your work, but how technical of a writer were you with respect to EMP and post-nuclear? Because I did studies on that back when I was in Spec Ops. How well technically read are you on that?
Wow, it's going to take a minute to unpack that. My PhD work at Purdue University was on military history, of course, and also the history of technology. So I was well aware of what EMP was. Around 2002, the congressional study came out on the effects of EMP, and read that. That got me started. I wanted to write a novel about it. But I got caught in the Tom Clancy model. You know, hero goes out, there's 3 missiles, he stops one, the other one goes haywire, whatever. So for 2 years, the book was going nowhere. Finally, it was a hot May day in 2005. I'm sitting in the graduation ceremony, and talk about hot, all those graduate robes on and everything else. I'm sweating to death. I wish the graduation speaker would just shut up and sit down. And I'm looking at the audience, and I call it the God moment. God's whispered in my ear. There's my story. I'm looking out at the graduates, kids I've known for 4 years, neighbors and friends. So I'm looking at a very close friend, an Omaha Beach vet, sitting in the first row, and I realized there's the story. Do the story about us. And I then went out, I just started interviewing a lot of people, the police chief, the pharmacist, the doctor, the veterinarian, farmers. And it kept, the same question: what do you do if the electricity turns off? And some of it was pretty frightening. Like when I went to the nursing home, where my father was at the time in the last months of his life. What do you do if the electricity goes off? And more than one case, I had people in tears at the end of an interview,
Yeah.
because they were saying, "My God, I never really thought of this." So that became the inspiration for writing the book 1 second after.
Yeah, it's amazing how fast we will go back to, I won't quite call it the Stone Age, but we'll certainly be back to the pre-industrial revolution.
Electricity, you call it the expectation of normalcy. Electricity has been the fundamental building block of our society for 120 years.
Oh yeah.
So it worked yesterday. It works today. We just keep on going every day going, it's going to work tomorrow. Well, suppose it no longer works.
Right.
That's the scary thought, that it no longer works. Where do we come back? Now, one point there, in the congressional studies, very good friend of mine, Dr. Peter Pry, who was really the main voice there. He became a good friend, unfortunately passed away some months ago. Dr. Pry used to say, it throws us back to 1870. When I met him for the first time, I said, I agree with everything you said except that. We won't be thrown back to 1870 because the people who lived in 1870 knew how to live in 1870. That was their world. We'll be thrown back 1,000 years. I mean, how many people know how to dig a well? How many know how a flush toilet works? How many can make gunpowder? How many can farm a field with horses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? We don't know how to function in that type of society. It causes a catastrophic shutdown.
Yeah. As a result of reading your series, again, you punched me in the face a few times. So I have a 60 kilowatt solar array that is hidden, and I've got a complete replacement 60 kilowatt solar array to take care of all the inverters and the charge controllers, so that if one gets fried, I've got a complete standby system. We've got DC powered air conditioning. We've got, so I go DC to DC rather than going through inverters for some of the power requirements. So we've really, I think it, and there's a standing invitation. If you ever find your way to Hampton Roads, Virginia, please consider coming out. It's not a big farm. We're only 6.5 acres, but on that 6.5 acres, like in the last 2 weeks, we added another 60 fruit trees. So we're up to around 250 fruit trees. We've got cows, pigs, ducks, turkeys, chickens, bees, goats. We're producing our own milk, cheese, butter. We've got enough power, water, and food put aside to take care of about anything you could possibly imagine. So now, do you live that way? Are you also as off-grid as John Matheson became? Because by telling me hang on, John, or I'm going to call you John now because of that. But Bill, you just said your father was in a nursing home, so that obviously inspired that part of your first book.
Yes. I remember when I sat down with the police chief, a very close friend, and I explained the scenario. I said, suppose the grid goes down. What do you do? How do you run the town? And he actually picked up the phone, and then he looked at me. He said, blankety blank, the phone doesn't work. I said, yeah, now what do you do? I go to the pharmacist. I say, suppose the power goes off. What do you do? How long? And she was in tears, because she's saying, what about people with cancer pain medication, pancreatic disorder, et cetera, et cetera? We don't know what we're going to do. We don't have the backups. I call it the Maslow's hierarchy of needs for a society. Number one, well, usually when I'm doing an interview, I'll ask you, the interviewer, where'd you get your water this morning? You know, and so what came out of the faucet? Well, think about the grid no longer works, so that doesn't work. Average town has only 20 days worth of food on hand, and then that's from what's in your fridge and melting to what's in the supermarkets and melting. Command and control, that's a big one.
Yeah.
How do you control society within a matter of days? How do you control disease? Because all the water, rivers will be polluted within a week or two because of overflow from non-functioning plants. How does nuclear power work when the grid is no longer functioning and you still have to cool the core? So all of these things start piling up to a catastrophic result. According to the congressional studies, between 80 to 90% of our citizens will be dead within a year after an event.
Bill, I did a strategic study back, oh heck, this was in the early 80s. And they basically said in 90 days, they expect 50% losses, and in 1 year, 90%. So that, and I think that sounds about right, because this country, if you think about where all the population density is, it's of course heavily in the cities. Well, the cities are going to be the first place to go. The 10% that's going to make it, for the most part, is, you know, the small farms, the rural areas where they, at least to some extent, have been creating food, water, and possibly electricity.
And right there. So you live in a city, it's 3 to 5 days out, and you turn to your spouse, I have to say wife, you know, male, female, but you turn to your spouse and your two non-binary, whatever kids, you say, we're getting the hell out of here. Because in the country, we'll be able to find something. So along interstate highways across the nation, people will be hoofing out thinking they're going to find a nice, friendly environment. While you on your farm is going, how do I protect my farm from being overrun and looted?
Right.
So that just compounds the problem.
I, as a result of what you wrote about, have EMP shielded communications, both short range and long range communications. I have an operating room set up at my farm.
Really?
With everything you could imagine to operate, yes. I have, and all powered by things that I still have power for, even in the zombie apocalypse, in whatever form it takes. Yeah. So yes, I have outfitted EKG's oxygen machines now. Things like oxygen isn't going to last that long, and I understand that, right? I've probably got enough for 10 operations, and then after that, it's an ambu bag and somebody squeezing it. But we're actually prepared at that level, and that's kind of, I'm telling you. And I can't remember, what was the name of the family where the wife worked for NASA, and they ended up, you, John, ended up in their place at the end getting your first hot, fresh meal in a year.
Linda and Earl, Ernie in the book. Linda just passed away about 3 months ago. We've been very close friends for 10 years. And my heart breaks over Linda passing away. She really did write the software to help put Apollo on the moon for the translunar injection. Earth orbit out. She's the one that helped write the software. And Ernie, Earl, he worked on the space shuttle. So a lot of the characters, their background stories are real stories, and there are two of them right there.
I figured as much. So that family. So the one question you didn't answer at the end of the first book, which I was wondering, why didn't you, John, ever go punch Ernie in the face and say, you had this capability, why didn't you take care of my daughter's insulin? That was the one thing that I thought, I think if I were John Matheson, I would have been a little pissed at Ernie for not offering that up.
Well, because he didn't know them at the time. When the book started, the Franklin, remember they're called the Franklin clan at the start, and he doesn't realize some of the resources they might have.
Okay.
It's already too late. And that was a bit of a plot hole pointed out to me later. There were ways of manufacturing antibiotics, anesthesia, and perhaps even insulin. But it was too late in this story.
So how much without giving away too many trade secrets, how much of a prepper are you? Do you have your own food, water, and electricity supply in the event something happens?
Yes.
Okay, fair enough. As I watch the geopolitical situation unfold, Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, North Korea, Iran, BRICS, India, I can't help but thinking that it's sort of it's a game of Russian roulette, so to speak. If you had 100 chambers in a barrel and you've only got one that's loaded with a bullet, you can probably play Russian roulette and survive 3 or 4 or 5 trigger pulls. But if you've got a 100-round pistol and you've got 40 rounds chambered, you probably only have maybe 1 or 2 spins before you're done. I'm going to give you a quote, because I was trying to think of the best way to summarize what you've done here, and I'm going to have to steal somebody else's quote because they said it better than I could have. A realistic zombie-free apocalypse novel that will make preppers happy and non-preppers nervous. So, good job. Overall,
Thank you.
Excellent job. I don't think I'm going out on a limb here saying that if you're publishing something that isn't based on sort of a woke leftist ideology, you have a hard time finding publishers and promoters. So how did you get, I mean, even back in 2009, don't get me wrong, we haven't taken the nosedive we've taken in the last 3 years, but how did you find a publisher? What was your approach to get to a publisher and say, read this, and by the way, you know, there's, because you've got a little bit of Christianity in it, you've got a lot of morals in it, you've got no homosexuality in it, you've got no transvestites, you've got, I mean, basically you've got sort of 1950s ma and pa central Iowa farmer, you know, families is kind of who you've got. How did you get that through a publisher?
I went through 7 publishers who kept rejecting it. Now, you got to realize at that point, I'd already sold close to 40 novels, mostly in science fiction, but also in history. I had a great agent. Tom Doherty is the publisher at Tor Forge. He's been a good, incredible friend for like 35 years, 30 years. And Tom picked it up. But even Tom was kind of a bit antsy. Well, we'll sell maybe 5 or 10,000 copies. And the book took off, became a New York Times bestseller. And Tom would turn around and say, my God, this one caught me off guard, but you're right. So he has been a great publisher.
So movie. When are we going to see the movie? Because here's what upsets me. 99% of the movies that are out today are garbage. And when I say they're atrocious.
Let me tell you a quick story on that. Okay, we've gone through 3 rewrites on the screenplay. We do have a team together. First was pretty darn good. Then they do a rewrite, and I'm starting to ask questions. By the time we got to the 3rd rewrite, it was the classic things blow up in the first minute, and planes are crashing, and people are screaming, and John Matheson goes forth to save the world. And I sarcastically said at this meeting, why don't we put a cruise ship in? It gets EMP. It becomes the Love Boat from hell.
There you go.
And they go, that's a pretty good idea. What the blank?
They didn't understand sarcasm, huh?
No, they didn't. They thought I was actually presenting a good idea. Book writers have very little influence on what's being done. I just pray that once we get through the WGA strike, which is the last thing holding us up, we get forward. But I don't want to have to sit there and in the first 5 minutes throw up and stagger out of the theater weeping. But I want a TV series. The producers are now talking about a movie, which will turn into a disaster.
Yeah, I see this as, I mean, if I threw in my 2 cents worth, I would think that you could probably make at least 1 year out of each book of like a Netflix 10-part series.
Yes, exactly. The last producer I worked with, we were starting to get close to really getting it out there. He was a pilot. He is no longer a pilot. He was flying in Montana, got caught in bad weather, and that was the end of him. And that was only 3 or 4 weeks before we were going to go forward. I was going out to Montana to meet him. He was a good friend.
All right. So when theoretically is there going to be like if you had to throw a dart at the wall, when would Dan Short be able to see his first episode of John and his daughters getting ready for dinner when things get quiet?
Fall of next year.
Really? So we're only a little over a year away?
Yeah. I mean, if we get the green light, you can do it within 6 to 7 months.
Outstanding. Have you already got a cast picked out?
Well, my mind, yeah, but again, what influence do I have? Very little.
Really? Is it that little? So do you get veto rights once you say, let's do a either some sort of a screenplay on this or adapt it in a different way? Do you get any rights, or at that point do you just sort of get neutered?
As that joke goes, book writers have very little influence unless you've gone through 3 or 4 successful movies. Then you start getting influence.
I have a hard time, in all honesty, watching a movie after I've read the book. I wish you Godspeed and good luck with getting it put on the screen in a way that at least it's still John and his family are still mostly who they are.
I hope so, because I think if that ever happened, I would scream, put out a press release and everything else, and I'm disassociated from this. They have to at least adhere to some of what I wrote.
But that's it? Is that what is there actually a sentence or a phrase that sort of like in the Constitution, the right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed? So is there a statement like that effectively covers what they're allowed to do to your story when they put it on a screen?
No. Ultimately, they'll find a way around it. I mean, your contracts run 30, 40 pages of fine print. And you can read through them until you go blind. I give them to my agent. She says, Bill, this is about the best we can get for right now. And my agent is a very, very experienced person. She's been in the business for 40 years. All I can do is, I know that the representative, my agent for film, who was a different person than the book person, he's trying to do his best. I'm not going to belittle him. He's trying to do his best to adhere to the story. But when it goes from him to the producers and then to the directors and everything else, and also the script writer, who seems to get a heck of a lot of money, things start changing.
When it's all said and done, is the cut that you actually get...
Oh, good. It's good.
Is it? Oh, it is decent.
Well, you know where I really make my money? Audiobooks. My agent retained control of the audiobooks. Currently, I'm getting more money from audio every couple of months than I am from the print media, because there's millions of people who are stuck in Boston traffic at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, or DC traffic 24 hours a day, that use audiobooks to keep their sanity. So audiobooks is the way to go. Paperback books are dead. They just don't publish anymore.
Yeah. So are you publishing hardback, softback, and digital now?
Yeah. Hardback, trade edition. They still publish some softback, and of course the audiobooks.
So if I bring a set of hardbacks up to you, which I don't have hardbacks yet, I've only got paperbacks and digital. If I bring a set of hardbacks, can I get you to sign those?
I think that could be arranged.
Okay, I'll talk to your what do we want to call them? Your handler? What do you call?
Yeah, my handler. My publicist. Yeah.
There you go. Your publicist.
That sounds like such a great line. Talk to my publicist.
Yeah, it does. You can be an elitist for a minute and say that. That's very cool.
No, she's been my publicist is a wonderful woman. When I retained her for $3,000 for a month, and she just said, if I don't sell 1,000 books, fire me. Well, she's sold, I think, a few more than 1,000 books across the last 14 years.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, how many are you up to? What's your total book sales of just the 3?
1 million.
1 million book sales?
Yeah.
It's not bad. Congratulations. What does it take to make New York Times bestseller list?
Uh-huh.
I know that's a moving target, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a moving target. It's a rigged game. I don't know how many times I've seen some suddenly on the New York Times. I know I've outsold them, but I'm not. But yes, I do make the New York Times, but it is a moving target. So three of my books have all been MYTs, and this current book will be projected to be that as well. So I made it, but I still live in the same house I've had for 30 years. I have my pets, I teach at a college. It hasn't affected my lifestyle at all. I just like doing what I do.
Yeah.
My daughter will get rich someday.
Well, I mean, if she's getting her PhD at Notre Dame, I would imagine she's probably going to have some of that on her own too. So
yes, she will. She's full scholarship. She's in her third year.
Yeah, outstanding. Bill, I can't thank you enough for taking the time out of your schedule to do this. You are exactly who I figured you would be based on the way you wrote. Bill, thank you for talking to me today on all things FantomWorks, and I certainly look forward to talking to you again.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.